All right, so for this week's episode, we are going to the Horn of Africa, to an amazing country, very little traveled, called Ethiopia. Now, honestly, Ethiopia is so rich culturally, historically, environmentally, that it was really difficult to narrow down the site to review. So, what I did was I excluded sites that were purely of ecological or environmental interest. I excluded sites that may be very old but are active sites of worship and activity, like the amazing rock churches of Lalibela. And then there were sites that are archaeological in nature but are very freestanding and easily visitable and in a great state of preservation, like the castles of Gondar. So this really narrowed down the list, and I wound up focusing on the Stele of Axum. Now, what are the Stelae of Axum? First of all, stele is a plural word of stele, Stele, and I'll explain that later. Now, first, let's zoom out for the context. Now, Ethiopia is one of very few countries in the world, Thailand is another one that comes to mind, that's really never been colonized. Now, Ethiopia was taken over by fascist Italy for just about 5 years in 1936, and the Italians were forced to withdraw after their humiliating defeat in World War II. But with such a short period of occupation, they didn't leave much of their imprint on Ethiopia. About the only thing you can see Italian in Ethiopia is the people do like their spaghetti with tomato sauce, which they, by the way, eat on top of injera bread. So it's like a carb bomb, and they eat everything with injera bread. And other than that, you see a few modifications to the royal palace in Addis Ababa. But other than that, you don't really see Italy in Ethiopia. Anyway, for that reason, it's a totally unique culture. But much of the history of this culture is shrouded in mysteries and legends and myths. So, the last ruling dynasty of Ethiopia, which was overthrown in 1974, that was the Emperor Haile Selassie, he was overthrown by a communist movement called the Derg, which was, initiated a terrible and tragic period in Ethiopian history. Well, that dynasty traced its origins all the way back to King David and Queen Sheba. And then that actually became somewhat popularized because of the Rastafarian movement, but that's a whole other story. But in any event, the point is this has a long history, but it's not really clear what is true and to what extent if we're talking about biblical stories. Anyway, since we're talking about the Queen of Sheba and King David of Israel, the population in Ethiopia used to be Jewish a long time ago. But after the Jews got expelled from Israel by the Romans, and that was in ancient times, some 2,000 years ago, the Jewish population of Ethiopia became separated from the rest of the Jews in the world. So it developed quite differently, and it looks very different. And that population existed until the 70s. They're called Falashas, Ethiopian Jews. And they basically all escaped the carnage that was going on at that time under the communist regimes, and they wound up in Israel, which is why you see a lot of Jews of African descent in Israel. So the Falashas, the Ethiopian Jews, even though there are not many of them left in Ethiopia, given their very unique history, their descent from King David, they're a proud bunch. And one of the things they have to be proud of is that they are supposedly guardians in their country of the Ark of the Covenant. So that's the thing from Indiana Jones that melted people's faces off. The Ark of the Covenant is supposedly located in a church in Axum. Nobody's allowed in to see it, and there's a guardian, and he's not allowed out ever.
I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of here.
Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Stewardess, please let me handle this.
I've got to get
Calm down. Now get back to your seat. I'll take care of this. Calm down. Calm down. Get a hold of yourself.
Well, then after that, in the 4th century, which is a period we will be discussing now, the ruling dynasty of Ethiopia converted to Christianity, and hence most of the country became Christian. But with the spread of Islam and the Islamic invasions in North Africa, once again, Ethiopia was cut off, this time from the Christian world. And it developed very, very differently. Prior to that invasion, believe it or not, Egypt had been the most populous Christian country in the world. Now it's a very populous Muslim country. So things were very, very different back then. But anyway, Ethiopian Christianity developed, flourished, became a thing unto itself. It's the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But the happy news is they actually maintained very good relations with their Muslim neighbors, because actually it was the Ethiopians who sheltered the Prophet Muhammad when he was evicted from Mecca. And you can still see where he was, and you can still see the supposed graves of his family members. So for that reason, it was a very, very peaceful place to be. So this is where we find ourselves. In the 4th century AD, King Ezana, and he's important for this segment, converted to Christianity. At the time, his country was predominant in the region. His dynasty was founded, the Aksumite dynasty, in 150 BC. And it rose in wealth and power due to its trade contacts with the Greco-Roman world, with Africa, and Arabia. So it was really a hub for trade. And that's also how it enters the written history. In the 1st century, Pliny the Elder, a Roman philosopher and historian, does mention Axum. In fact, at this time, Greek was widely spoken in Axum, and it was believed there were large Greek communities living there. So everything was hunky-dory until 960 AD, when Judith, a Jewish warrior queen, ransacked the place. And how cool is that? A warrior queen? Take that, Xena, warrior princess. Anyway, so Axum was on the rise and near its peak when King Ezana converted to Christianity. However, if you're going to change something as important to people as their religion, you've got to do it carefully. So one of the strategies that's happened in many different contexts as, ruling dynasties and governments changed their religion is they incorporated elements from what was there already, to try to rock the boat as little as possible and let the people keep some of their traditions. However, they'd put a twist on it. So suddenly, for example, this sacred Druidic grove becomes a place that Jesus visited, and that's why it's so special. Or the day for the Roman sun god suddenly becomes Christmas, the birthday of the baby Jesus. So that's exactly what happened with our stele, or remember, that's the plural of form of stele. That's what happened. It was an older tradition that was incorporated into the new Christian practices of the dynasty. Now, what were these stelae used for? They were basically used to commemorate the dead. Most of the big ones, anyway, seem to have tombs and burials underneath them or nearby. So that was the point. They were funerary. And why are they called stele, a stele, you ask, and not like an obelisk? Well, it has to do with the top. An obelisks have that pyramidal shape. These stelae are kind of rounded at the top, so that's why they're not obelisks. So there are two kinds of stelae in Axum. The most famous ones, of course, are the ginormous ones. And these range from about 15 meters or 50 feet in height to 33 meters or about 108 feet in height. So they're pretty tall. Now, they're elaborately carved, resembling like a multi-story building with a door at the base. And there's a lot of interpretations behind this, but the thought is that maybe they gave the king access, all the way because they're so tall to heaven. That's what it's supposed to represent. And of course, the really big ones are for the kings. Where they found the architectural inspiration for these stelae is unknown, but there is some suggestion that they do resemble some ancient and poorly documented and understood towers in what is today southwestern Saudi Arabia. Now, that's not at all far-fetched, considering at the time, Axum was a great empire that stretched into present-day Yemen and even Oman. So that's an area that definitely would have been known to them. So it is possible. Now, unfortunately, most of them toppled. There's only two that are currently freestanding. Some toppled even since the 1906 excavation. Some, it's thought, toppled in the 18th or 19th century. And one, in fact, the Great Stele, the one that's like 100 whatever feet tall, that probably toppled as it was being erected or not long after. Now, the big guy is unique because it's elaborately carved on all four sides, whereas the others, big ones, are blank on the back. And it did collapse, and in its fall, it crushed a megalithic tomb called today Nefas Mocha. In fact, there are tombs all around the stela, but these actually were long ago looted, so there wasn't much found in them. And those looters were really, really tenacious. So they dug a lot of holes, and it's believed that actually destabilized the stela, which is why some of them fell. And also the sandy soil in the area didn't really help. But nearby the stela, among the stela field, you can find a whole bunch of tombs. The tomb of the false door, the tomb of bricks, the mausoleum, and there's still certainly others buried underground. The Great Stele is supposedly dedicated to King Ramhai, but I couldn't find much information about him, and I'm not really sure how airtight that is, because remember, most of Ethiopian history is shrouded in mysteries, and it's kind of mixed up. So, for example, all over the country, you'll find various monuments and places that supposedly belong to Queen Sheba. Like in Axum, there's a palace that supposedly belonged to her. But this was dated much, much later than she would have been alive. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of myths you'll hear if you visit these places. Now, as I mentioned, there's only two of the big stela that are freestanding. One of those is known as the Roman stele, and that's had a pretty interesting life. So let's start there. You see, fascist Italy stole that one in 1937 after it occupied the country. But as we know, that didn't last too long. And after Italy's defeat in World War II, it promised in a treaty to give the stele back. That was in 1947. But just to turn the knife, what Italy did with the stele when they did take it was they erected it right in front of the Ministry of African Colonies in Rome. So the irony of that, they stole something from the African colonies and they put it up in Rome. Anyway, it stayed there until 2005. So the Italians really dragged their feet on this one. To be fair, it was logistically very complicated and expensive, but there was even some talk that they tried to weasel their way out of it, and this is how. That Ministry of Colonies is very short-lived. That later became the UNFAO, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. So there was some talk like, well, heritage is global for all of humanity, and we put this thing in front of what's now a global organization, so maybe it should just stay there and represent all of humanity. Well, as you can imagine, that one did not fly too well with Ethiopia and some others. Already broken in 5 pieces when the Italians first took it, when they took it down in Rome, they were able to break it into 3 pieces along some of the original cracks, and they flew it in, I believe, 3 separate cargo planes, 3 flights to Ethiopia over the year 2005. And they would have to do this because this thing weighed a shit ton at 170 tons, as it was all originally one slab of granite. And supposedly it was the most heavy parcel ever delivered. Now, it was re-erected in Axum in 2008 after a lot of painstaking work to keep it stable. So they, I believe, put some concrete under it so it wouldn't fall again. So this was a big win for repatriation, a topic we've talked a little bit about. And repatriation is a more complex topic than is sometimes portrayed in the media. But one good thing is that the attitudes towards it have progressed a lot in recent years. So when, it was first agreed to be returned to Ethiopia, that was just kind of because winner takes all. Winners get the spoils. It wasn't because of some recognition that, countries should return the stuff they've looted. It was basically Italy lost, we want our stuff back. However, by the 2000s, again, that was not going to fly. And it was recognized that this was a pretty clear-cut case for repatriation. It was stolen without any kind of justification after only 5 years in the country. Or actually, no, it was stolen when Italy, the year after they arrived, after they took over. So there was really very little justification to keep this thing, and it was a very, very obvious case for repatriation. Another noteworthy one is King Ezana's stele. He was the one who converted to Christianity, and his stele is definitely attributable. What makes it so unique is that's one that actually never fell. So of the big ones, there's only two standing, but one of them is the Roman one, which was actually broken when the Italians took it. So the King Ezana's is the only one that's been standing the whole time, which is quite an accomplishment for something that's more than 1,500 years old and something like 68 feet high. So that is really the real deal. However, in 2008, when the Roman stele was erected, they did take some works to stabilize King Ezana's stele because it was leaning somewhat precipitously. Otherwise, there are 3 or 4 other monumental stela ranging in height from approximately 6 to 18 meters, that would be 18 to 80 feet, but these have all since toppled. These big guys in the main stela field, because there are 2 other areas around Axum with stela, well, they must have been an awe-inspiring sight in their day. They were erected sort of in a hill overlooking the city, so everyone could look up and see the kings looking over them or watching out for them. Now, the effect is a little bit lost today because the modern city has changed, but it must have been pretty awe-inspiring at the time. Amazingly, these giant stela were all carved from single pieces of granite and brought from a place called Gobo Dura Hill, which is actually 4 kilometers away. So that's a lot of stone to move. Now, they know it was from that spot because they've actually found the signs of quarrying. So you could think of that as like the birthplace of the stela. Just like if you go to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, you could see the birthplace of the Moai. But anyway, that's for another episode, which, well, I will do at a later time. So how did they move all these stones? How did they do it? Nobody really knows. Probably a lot of the same techniques, similar techniques that were used to move, for example, the stones of Stonehenge or the stones of the pyramid. Maybe something more sophisticated, because remember, this is a lot later than those. Stonehenge was like 3,000 years BC, and the pyramids even, older, some of them. So maybe there was some greater technology involved. So there's some ideas, but to my knowledge, no one has done any experimental archaeology on that, the way they have done with the pyramids, with the Easter Island Moai, etc. And that brings me to another point, which is there's still so much we don't know about this site. Part of the reason was because it was altered and maintained over the years, but without records really being kept. It was looted, as I mentioned, a lot, and it was left to decay. So it's quite, heavily altered over the years. Now, there have been a bunch of excavations there, which I will go into, but these are quite limited in scope or really old. So it was before, the most modern and scientific methods were available. As far as I can tell, the first serious archaeological work done on site was done in 1906 by a German team led by a guy called Littmann. Now, they published their work in 1913, and this is where, the high-quality drawings that I've been showing you, this is where they were produced. And this was the first team to systematically map the site. Now, they gave the different stela numbers, and that brings me to the next point, which there are actually hundreds of stela, hundreds. But they're just not all the monumental ones I've been talking about, of which there are 6 or 7. At the main stela field that we've been talking about, there's a total of 120 of them. Then at a site west known as Gudit Stela Field, remember that's our Jewish warrior queen. There are literally hundreds of the smaller stela. And then there's yet another site southeast of this area, which there's a handful of them. So there's quite a lot of stela all around the city of Axum. However, most of these are pretty much unadorned. A lot of them are buried or fallen over. So not much is really known about them. All we can safely say is they probably weren't great and powerful kings and rulers like the giant ones would have been for. Anyway, the French had their turn in 1954 to 1957 with their excavations. But as far as I could tell, there were no big aha moments that arose out of that dig.
I'm having an aha moment with Steve.
The Brits, led by Neville Chittick, had their excavation from 1972 to 1974. And it was at that time that a lot of those tombs were excavated. And then much later, another British team led by a guy named David Phillipson, that was from 1993 to 1997. They had some excavations. I didn't find too many takeaways. I think one of them was by the car park, but the main one that I read about was at the site where the Roman stela had been. And this sort of mapped the topography at the time the stela was erected. And that work was taken over by an Ethiopian team led by a guy called bygone. Then there was a joint French-Ethiopian excavation in 1999. This was again in that same area around the base of where the Roman stela was. And through this, they determined sort of how the bases for the stela were established, with several layers of nesting stones and like a mortar-like substance. So, it was pretty hard to keep these things upright. And as we know, it wasn't so successful. Finally, in the 2000s, there was some limited geophysical surveys, which did show anomalies under the ground, which may very well be tombs that are still under there. So that all sounds like a lot of research, but as mentioned, a lot of it was quite limited. Some of it was done a long time ago without modern methods. And as far as I can tell, there really hasn't been an effort incorporating the latest techniques and a lot of science that can tell us, a lot that we don't already know. Now, as for the visit, it's interesting. There's a museum on site, but there's not a whole lot of information. You will need a guide. I can't remember. A guide might even be compulsory, but there's no point in going without one. That's the point. And when you're on your tour listening, you do have to have your bullshit meter turned up. Because remember, a lot of what you'll hear in Ethiopia is, myths, and it's hard to sometimes parse that with what's known definitively. Now, that small museum adjacent to the site is actually interesting with a good collection. They have a bunch of these ancient stone tablets written in a variety of ancient languages, old coins, drinking vessels, and a 700-year-old Bible. Now, you actually see quite a few of those in the ancient churches of this northern Ethiopian region because it's quite dry, and the Bible seemed to survive well in that climate. But man, you got to go get that shit laminated.
There are a few basic things to understand just how a laminator works.
Now, this northern region is called Tigray, and it's chock full of amazing sites. My favorite were the rock churches of Gibraltar, where priests would live a semi-hermetic existence. Now, it was a pretty treacherous climb up there, but you're well rewarded for the experience and the views. And if you're lucky, you'll meet a very nice hermit priest. But seriously, it was hairy getting up there. There were times where we had to take off our shoes because we couldn't grip the sheer rock. However, if Tigray rings a bell, it's probably for all the wrong reasons. There was just a ruinous war fought there from 2020 to 2022 because there was a rebel group in Tigray that really felt that they get the shaft from the central government and they're not treated well. You see, Ethiopia is a mosaic of different ethnicities, groups, tribes, and so stability is never really a sure thing. But they were able to make peace. It just was after tens or even hundreds of thousands of deaths and millions of refugees. So even though this ended, 2 years ago or so, I'm not really sure what the visit there now is like. And that's the thing about Ethiopia. It has an incredibly rich history and culture, but more recently it's known for war, famine, and its maniacally violent communist regime in the 1970s and 80s. Like I said, known for all the wrong reasons. But as you travel around the country, you'll find the people to be hospitable and proud. And honestly, the food is great. It's the closest comparison I could make is Indian food, but it is really quite different and very special and very unique, just like the whole country. However, it's not easy to get there and to get around. The infrastructure's poor, so you'll need to hire a driver and a guide, and that isn't cheap. But just like those rock churches of Gibraltar, you will be richly rewarded for your trouble. So there you have it, the Stelae of Axum, a really, really cool site, a good example of repatriation in this very unique and mysterious country. I definitely recommend a visit. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.